what you will learn at Cloud Booster as well. So again, this is just introducing you to the concept. Nothing deep dive. When you come into the training, we'll go deep dive into all of these concepts. So we're looking at storing data on the cloud, right? And for Amazon Web Services, for AWS, the major AWS service that we use for that is what we call the Amazon S3. And I'll tell you what that means shortly. So in today's lecture, in this part of the lecture, we're going to look at what S3 is. We're going to look at S3 buckets and objects, S3 versioning, what we call S3 storage classes, S3 lifecycle policies, S3 security, what we call encryption, and then we'll look at some case studies even as we go along. Now, S3 means simple storage service. So it's like SSS. So that's what we mean by S3. And it's one of the main building blocks of AWS. In fact, this was one of the very, very first AWS services that brought in the world of cloud computing. So S3 is a simple, secure, durable, and highly scalable object storage service from AWS. And with S3, you can store all kinds of files. Just anytime you think of S3, just think of a folder on your computer. So if you look at this image on the right, you can see that we have PNG file, like image file. You can store in there. You can store a video file, MP4. You can store MP3. You can store normal text file, whether it's doc, PDF, text, whatever it is. You can store all types of files. It's the same as a folder on your laptop. But of course, you now have a lot more features than just a random folder on your laptop. With a folder on your laptop, you just store a data, you just store something there. But with S3, there's now a lot of integrations that you can do that just makes it really, really cool. It's a very popular AWS service. A lot of exam questions come from Amazon S3. So you're going to have to deal with S3 a lot on your cloud journey, right? Even if it's just for storing, sometimes you use it to process data. Sometimes you do a lot with S3. You incorporate it with other services. And today you're actually going to do practical. You're actually going to create your S3 buckets, build a website from them, and see how it works practically. And that's our model at Cloud Booster. We don't just teach you concepts randomly. And someone was in my DM earlier as well saying that, oh, I've learned these things, but it's just theory. That can never happen at Cloud Booster because everything you learn, as you're doing the theory, you're learning the practical. A case study of S3 is Pinterest. Some of you know Pinterest, right? Pinterest actually uses S3 to store and send billions of images to its users. S3 helps Pinterest to store and deliver images at scale, and is also integrated with other AWS services like Amazon CloudFront and Amazon Elastic Transcoder. Another organization we're familiar with is Spotify. Spotify actually uses S3 to store and serve its music streaming service to millions of users around the world. S3 helps Spotify to store and process vast amounts of data and also deliver it at scale. So now when we talk about the concept of S3 buckets, an S3 bucket is actually the basic unit of storage in S3. And that's what is similar to a folder, right, on your computer. While an object is the file that is stored in an S3 bucket. So if you look at the image on the right again, you can see object here being stored in an S3 bucket, and then you now have an S3 bucket with objects. So anytime you see an image like this, you can see it's an S3 bucket. If they put this additional shapes, you can see that they're referring to an S3 bucket that has objects inside. So a bucket is a container or directory where objects can actually be accessed and stored. Now, to create an S3 bucket, you create it using the AWS Management Console. That says you go into your AWS account and then you click Create S3 bucket, which you do today, or you actually use the command line interface. Some of you are familiar with this. So it's when you're accessing, AWS using lines of code as opposed to actually using a graphic user interface. As opposed to actually seeing what you're clicking, you're actually just interacting with lines of code. So S3 bucket can be integrated with other services to provide additional functionality for storing and processing data. Again, all kinds of files can be stored in S3. So things to think about when you're choosing a name for your S3 bucket, you need to think about some things. You should not have any uppercase letters. There should be no use of underscore. The text should be between 3 to 63 characters long. You can't use an IP. An IP is a series of numbers that are used to identify computers. And then you must actually start with a lowercase letter. Another thing to have in mind when you're naming your S3 bucket is that an S3 bucket name has to be unique globally. So which means that if you create an S3 bucket, somebody else cannot create an S3 bucket that has exactly the same name. So when you're creating your S3 buckets today, you will see that will tell you to add some unique characters at the end so that it makes it very unique. The reason for that is that you can actually use S3 buckets to host a website. So just the same way two websites cannot have exactly the same name, if your S3 bucket is being used to host a website, which you do today, then the domain name for that website cannot be the same as somebody else's domain name. So S3 buckets always have to be unique globally. Even if it's someone that is in France that creates a bucket that has a particular name, you cannot create a bucket with that name. You have to add unique characters to make it unique. And then for S3 objects, which is what files within the S3 buckets, it usually consists of the following. Usually you have a key for it. That's the name that you assign to an object. You have the value, the content you're storing, you have the version ID, if version is enabled, which I'll talk about shortly. And then we have what we call metadata as well. So you can actually add a set of name value pairs with which you can store information regarding the object. So if, for example, you want to add additional information about a file, you want to say, okay, let's say, for example, you're storing a movie file in an S3 bucket and you want to add, okay, you want to add who the producer of the movie is. You can create a name value pair like that. You can say movie producer, put the name, movie director, put the name, you can put the date the movie was released, you can put the name. So these are additional metadata information about the object that you can actually add to the object. Again, these are things that make S3 really cool. So most of the things you can do on S3, you can't do it randomly with a folder on your laptop. So it's just an analogy for you to know that, okay, S3 bucket is like a folder, keeps the same on your laptop. You can store any kind of file. Even if your laptop cannot open it, it will still store it there, right? That's how you have an S3 bucket. And then the objects can have all of these features I just described. Now, we also have what we call versioning in S3. Another thing that makes S3 really, really cool. So versioning enables users to keep multiple versions of objects in the same S3 bucket. And you can actually use this for every single file type. So anytime you have versioning enabled, right, each time you upload an object into the S3 buckets that you have versioning enabled, instead of that object to be overridden, what you have is that a new version of that object is created. And versioning provides an additional layer of data protection and also prevents accidental deletes. So you actually have to enable it on the bucket. So when you create a bucket, there's a way to select that you want versioning either enabled or disabled. Now, this is an example that just brings what I just read out, makes it more practical. For example, you can have a file that you call info.txt. If you have a file called info.txt and the only content on that file is I am a girl, you can upload this file to an S3 bucket. If you have S3 versioning enabled on that particular bucket, what happens is that if this file on your computer, you decide to edit it and add more things, like I'm a girl living in London, the file still remains the same. It's still the same name, but now you've added more content. Because you have versioning enabled, what happens is that this file that if you decide that you want to upload it again to your S3 bucket, what happens is that S3 will store another copy of the file. And then the same thing goes on and on again. If you edit the file again and say, I'm a girl living in London with my dog, again, that if you upload it again to your S3 bucket that has versioning enabled, another copy of your file is stored. So this way you can go back to any copy that you want at any point in time. But also bear in mind, when you have versioning enabled, there's additional cost. So you don't need it all the time, but it's a very powerful feature, right? Just to ensure that you prevent, you can always go back to a previous version if you want to. Another thing that versioning does is that anytime you actually delete a file that has versioning enabled, what happens is that it doesn't actually get deleted. A delete marker is added to that file. So this is what happens. A delete marker is placed on that file, and you can remove that delete marker anytime. So the good thing about this is that it prevents accidental delete. So it's just something for you to be aware of, that it's a feature that you can use next. Again, these are things that begins to differentiate it from just having a phone on your laptop. There's so many things that you can do with S3. So versioning is one of it, and it's very, very important. You can't delete anything that has versioning enabled. If you want to delete it, you're sure you want to delete it, then you have to disable versioning on that bucket, and then you delete your file, okay? But like I said, as an architect, you always have to have balance of functionality and cost. It's not everything you need, no matter how cool the technology is. If you don't need that technology, there's no point of using it. So we also have what we call S3 storage classes, right? S3 has a range of different storage classes. Again, each is designed to meet different performance, durability, availability, and cost requirements. So with S3 storage classes, again, this is also something that makes S3 a lot more affordable. So S3 standard is the most expensive. And then as you go down this line, you can see that this graph is talking about access frequency. These are files that you want to access very, very frequently, right? You put them within the ones in this earlier stage, earlier parts of the graph. So for example, if you have a file stored in an S3 standard storage class, what happens is that files that you use very, very frequently, you store it in S3 standard. But there are also other storage classes. I won't go into the details when you take the course, you'll go into the details of that, but I'll give you the general gist, which is what you need at this level. You can actually decide that if you don't need a file to be stored, if you don't need to access a file very frequently, for example, maybe a manual for how to use a particular software which you've already mastered the software, you don't need the manual again, but you still don't want to delete it. What happens is that you can actually keep that particular file in one that in one of these later buckets. So we have what we call S3 Glacier Deep Archive, for example. So if you store the file there, right, you know that you don't need to access it very frequently. The advantage of that is that it is cheaper to store a file in Glacier Deep Archive than S3 standard. So as you go down this graph, the cost is actually getting reduced. And what happens is that, if you need to access a file very, very frequently, it's more expensive to store. Right. And if you don't mind, you don't access the file very frequently and all, like, you can just leave it in deep archive. So that way, files that maybe you need to access just once a year, sometimes log files, manuals, all these things that you just don't want to delete them, but you need them, audit files, for example, you can keep them in deep archive, right? It wouldn't cost you a lot to keep it there. But files that you need to access very, very frequently, you keep them in these ones. And then we also have what we call intelligent tiering, where the access pattern is actually predicted using AI, right? Using machine learning. You're able to, if you decide to use S3 intelligent tiering, what happens is that S3 actually studies how frequently you're accessing a particular file. And then if you keep it in S3 standard, but you don't really access it very frequently, if you enable intelligent tiering, it would move that file for you into an S3 standard IA or whatever is more relevant. So all I need to understand from storage classes is that you can actually determine the storage class for your S3 buckets, right? You can determine it. And if you choose to use a storage class that is, and you choose to, if you know that you're not going to access your files very, very frequently, you can choose to use a storage class that is less expensive, that is cheaper. That way you pay less and then it's also still fit for purpose. These kind of questions come out a lot when it comes to your AWS exam. They will give you different scenarios. Or somebody wants to store this, somebody wants to store that, what kind of storage class should they use? You need to understand deeply the scenario. This is just introducing you. So also retrieval time is something to take into account. If you put a file in deep archive, it takes longer to retrieve it, right? It can take minutes, sometimes hours. But again, if you put in S3 standard, it just takes milliseconds for you to retrieve that file back. But again, the longer it takes to retrieve, the cheaper it is. So again, it's always a balance of functionality. What am I trying to do? What kind of files are we handling here? Another good example is this S3 one zone IA. This particular storage class is if you want to store files that, if it gets deleted, you don't mind. All the files that are stored within S3 one zone IA, they are only available in one zone, one availability zone. Every other one is available in multiple availability zone. But if you use one zone IA, it means that if that availability zone should go down and the documents get missing, you don't mind. And there are use cases for that as well. Documents that are easily recreatable, you can put it there, right? So just be aware that there are different storage classes that we can use. We also have what we call lifecycle policies, right? And this enables you to transition objects between different storage classes or even expire them after a period of time. So for this is an example of how you can use S3 lifecycle policy. Again, it begins to just differentiate it from, this is no longer the level of folder on your laptop. We're now talking about really, really cool technology that you can use with just the fact that you're storing data on the cloud. You can actually decide that, this particular file that I want to store, I want us to keep it within the S3 standard storage class initially for the first 30 days, right? And 30 days after, I want you to move it to S3 standard infrequently accessed because it's cheaper and I don't need to access it very frequently again. You can decide that, okay, after 60 days, let's move that file into what we call S3 Glacier again because it's cheaper. And then you can say that after 465 days, let's delete that particular object. So this is what we call S3 lifecycle configuration. You can actually determine the entire lifecycle of a file from the point of creation. So you can just make that decision upfront. From point of creation, you make the decision that, okay, let it be in standard, let's move it to standard IA, let's move it to S3 Glacier, and let's delete it. Okay, so it's really, really cool technology you have right there. We also have what we call encryption in S3. Encryption is the process that translates information using an algorithm that makes the original information unreadable. Some of you may have heard this before. I always say when you think of encryption, just think of padlock and key, right? You want to secure something, you put a padlock on it, and then you go away with the key, right? That's how encryption works. So when you encrypt your data, you're kind of putting a padlock on your data, you're securing your data, you're transforming your data into a language that is unreadable. And then in order for you to decrypt it, you need a key. A decryption key. So a decryption is the process of converting that encrypted data back into the original readable format. So this is possible in S3. You can decide that you want to encrypt data in S3, whatever it is, like you encrypt it even before you put it within S3, just so that nobody can access it. It's not readable. Or you can have it within S3 and then you encrypt it within S3 as well, using one of the S3 encryption methods. So encryption is a means of securing digital data using one or more mathematical techniques. So within S3, you can protect and encrypt your data. You can encrypt it while in transit. You see the padlock and key I was talking about. While in transit, that is as it moves to and from your Amazon S3, or you can encrypt it at rest, right? While it is stored on disk in the data center, while it's stored within your S3 bucket, you can actually encrypt it as well. So more industry use cases of S3. There's a lot. S3 is a whole lot. It's a whole lot, but let's just leave it here for now. Other use cases, like I talked about, even NASA, they use S3. So NASA uses Amazon S3 to store and process vast amounts of scientific data collected from space mission and experiment. You can imagine NASA. Do you know how much data NASA has to process? And they do all that within S3. So S3 enables NASA to store and access this data securely and reliably. Airbnb as well, they use S3 to store and serve user-generated content like photos, videos, and reviews, right? S3 helps Airbnb to provide a seamless experience to the users by delivering fast and reliable content. So every time you go to Airbnb and you see the picture of that house, just know that it's being served from an S3 bucket somewhere, which you are also going to create your S3 bucket today and serve a particular website from it. So S3 is really cool. It's something you need to be familiar with. There are many other modules in cloud. Like I said, at the end of today's bootcamp, I'll tell you the things that you're going to be doing with us at Cloud Booster. But again, this just introduces you and then gives you an opportunity to actually build something on the cloud, which I'm sure you're all excited about. I am excited. I can't wait to hear you talk about your experience, building something on the cloud today. So thank you so much for listening. Do we have any questions from this particular lecture? Any questions at all? Any questions before we go into other things? You still have other exciting things. You have your lab session, you have quiz, and then I'll tell you about what the course is about. So any questions at all? All right. If you don't have any questions, I am just going to hand you back to Ife. Thank you all for listening. And again, you can always ask your questions all day long, right? If you remember, at some point later, feel free to ask. We are here for you. Today is all about you. Thank you, everyone. Ife.